additional funds for the area of relief for the whole state of Alaska, particularly the disaster areas. The House right now is just biding its time. They have sent Representative Miller and Senator Banfield to escort the governor here to the House chambers, and the House at the present time stands in recess. We have with us here this afternoon Genie Chance from KINY in Anchorage, who has been, I think her voice is familiar to all of us in southeastern as well as most of the state of Alaska now, after the tremendous job of reporting that was carried on out of Anchorage. So, Genie, we understand that as long as the governor was in Anchorage, you were fairly close to his operations and such as that. How busy was the boy?
Here is the governor now.
Yeah, he is now and being escorted up to the podium by Senator Banfield and Representative Miller. He now shakes hands with Senator Atwood and Bruce Kendall, Speaker of the House, and we will now have the speech by the governor. It's being introduced by Atwood. Here is the senator.
We all realize the disaster that struck the state of Alaska, and certainly our governor has been very close to it, and I'm sure we'll all enjoy his report. Governor Egan.
Mr. President of the Senate, Mr. Speaker of the House, members of the second session of the Third State Legislature, fellow Alaskans. In the history of the United States as a nation, no governor has had to make a report to a state legislature such as the one I shall deliver today. In all of our history, there has never been a natural disaster to equal the one Alaska suffered almost at this very hour, exactly 1 week ago. Many disasters have caused great loss of life. Many have resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in damage to property. But the Alaska earthquake is unparalleled for its impact on a single state's population, homes, businesses, public facilities, and commerce. I say this not to emphasize the dramatic. There has been enough drama, too much drama, enough and more than enough to last each and every one of us a lifetime. But I say it so the scope of the problem that has erupted upon us may be placed in its rightful perspective. We all know the details. The immediate past is one that we shall never forget. It is the future that now concerns us. But at the outset, I want to say a few words about a feature of this calamity that has captured the imaginations throughout our nation and around the world. It has often been said that adversity makes the man. Today, Alaska is a land of giant men. No one would have blamed the tens of thousands of persons who suffered most from expressing panic at the sudden horrors they faced. But from the very first moment until now, there has been no panic. There has been no despair. The story of how Alaskans met this greatest of natural disasters is already a living legend. I hope it is one that is never forgotten by any of us. Before first light last Saturday morning, before anyone could even begin to guess at the total extent of damage or death, all communities affected were under control. Reconstruction committees had even been formed. What is it like to have your world turned upside down? To lose relatives and friends, to lose homes, to watch buildings crumble and familiar landmarks erased from the earth in an instant. And then to bounce back, pick up the pieces and look to the future. That is what the majority of Alaskans, not only in the affected area, but all over Alaska, have done since last Friday. the names of ordinary individuals turned heroes is far too long to be recorded here. They include those in the State Civil Defense Organization who instantly responded and effectively set in motion all necessary emergency functions. They include those in the city administrations of Anchorage, Valdez, Seward, Kodiak, Cordova, and elsewhere, village chieftains, radio station announcers and reporters, ham operators, doctors, nurses, firemen, policemen, CAP pilots, utility workmen, National Guardsmen. The list is endless. It includes the officers and men of the Alaskan Command and all its branches, and who have written new chapters in the annals of civilian-military partnership. I only wish I could recognize everyone by name who has contributed so much. The immediate past is one of tragedy, but it is also one that makes every one of us in this room today feel very proud indeed to be members of such a community. In looking at the future, we are immediately confronted with some harsh facts. First, we know that there are still thousands of Alaskans without homes and without jobs, lost as a result of the earthquake and its aftermath of tidal wave and fire. Second, we know that the property loss will total hundreds of millions of dollars, losses that take many forms: private homes, places of business, streets and highways, public utilities such as water, sewage, telephone and power systems, fishing vessels, boat harbors and shore-based facilities, public buildings such as schools, the Anchorage International Airport Terminal building, Harborview Nursing Home District highway buildings, and a great number of other areas. We are working on a factual compilation of total restoration costs that will be completed, we hope, within a few hours. Following this, his visit to Alaska, the director of the United States Office of Emergency Planning, Mr. McDermott, estimated the loss at $500 million. Our present totals give us no reason to doubt the accuracy of Mr. McDermott's estimate, and this only includes the loss in the private sector in the local communities, the loss to the state. It does not include the federal losses, such as the cost, what the cost will be of rehabilitating the Alaska Railroad and other federal buildings that were destroyed and other facilities such as that. This means that the loss will likely be, for state purposes, about 7 times greater than the total general fund budget the legislature was considering at the time of the disaster. This gives you some idea of the staggering loss in relation to regular state financing. Third, we know that state revenues will be affected, but it is simply impossible at this time for anyone to know what that effect will be. It may be 90 days before we may make a reasonable and meaningful estimate based on known conditions. And I want to say to you, the legislators of the state of Alaska, just as quickly as we have some meaningful picture of what the loss, of what the state's financial picture is and what the losses are, it may very well be, of course, that certain things will occur that will not mean that there will be any real large substantial revenues to the state lost at this time. But I will report to you immediately that we have some practical and meaningful figures. Fourth, we know that our resource-based industries survive virtually intact, except for certain area segments of the fishing and fisheries industry. Petroleum, hard rock minerals, timber and pulp, and those fields were affected hardly at all from the standpoint of being able to carry on in their productive capacity. Our fisheries industry suffered a blow, but our analysis indicates it was not as great as originally feared. Tourism will not decline because of the earthquake. The major tourist agent and operator dealing in the Alaska travel business said just yesterday that he felt this would be our greatest year yet for tourism. The resource, it's true that in certain areas, certain of these towns, the visiting traffic will be upset. But for instance, in the major city, Anchorage, there wasn't, amazingly, insofar as rooms available that visitors usually utilize, in that particular field, there wasn't too much damage and the lodging facilities available there in that particular respect will not be too drastically affected. The resource sector of the economy came through almost unscathed. Finally, we know that despite our heavy losses, there is almost unanimous confidence in Alaska's future. There have been many such expressions by some of the most important members of the nation's financial community. The nation's commercial leaders have expressed great confidence in many ways. Offers have been made to restock local product inventories at no cost to the Alaskan wholesaler. Many having service contracts with Alaska businesses have advised those businesses that regular payments would not be expected for an indefinite period. In some cases, they will be forgiven entirely. This is the type of confidence and goodwill the private business community of America is demonstrating toward Alaska. And the American people, individually, with wires and letters by the thousands, and collectively through the federal government, have left no doubt of their concern and their confidence in our future progress. The immediate tasks were twofold: to care for casualties and to provide for the protection of health and property, and to restore vital community functions, water and power and telephone service, reopening closed transportation links, streets, highways, and ocean transportation. With this machinery now established, we have devoted our attention to the reconstruction itself. This has taken many forms. First, an assessment of total damages. As I have stated, this will be completed before we leave for Washington to meet with leading officials there, including the President of the United States. Second, a determination of which channels to funnel assistance through to keep the economy strong, to protect homeowners, businessmen, and all other aspects of the private sector of the community life. And third, a determination of necessary legislation, both on the federal and state level, including plans for making reconstruction money available. On Sunday, I plan to go to Washington to meet with President Johnson and the committee he has created to speed the reconstruction effort. Senator Clinton Anderson of New Mexico, chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee and a longtime friend of Alaska, has been appointed chairman of that committee. With me will be representatives of the state government, the municipalities involved, key members of the state's financial and business community, and members of the legislature, and others who will provide valuable assistance in working out a firm program for reconstruction. Since last Friday, I have spoken a number of times to President Johnson and to other high-level members of the federal government regarding our situation. There is no question that the President is behind us 100% and shares our desire to get down to work immediately on a crash program to rebuild Alaska's stricken areas. This knowledge has been a constant source of strength to all of us who have been coordinating efforts with the federal government. Because Alaska is an integral part of the national life, its loss is a national loss, but primarily it is ours. The spirit and will to rebuild here is unquestioned, and I have no doubt that all Alaskans from Ketchikan to Point Barrow share a common desire to contribute every penny we can possibly muster in our own behalf. As you know, I said Wednesday in Anchorage that I will ask this legislature to enact a proposal authorizing the sale of $50 million in general obligation bonds for reconstruction progress and purposes. For Alaska, such a program is large, far, far larger than anything we have ever before attempted as a state or territory. In my view, it represents the full extent of the state's ability to finance its own future in the wake of our common disaster. Sale of this amount of bonds would, depending upon interest rates received, an additional $2.7 to $3 million a year in payments for principal and interest. We all want to help ourselves financially. And in my view, this proposal is the only realistic means for doing so. While $50 million is a large sum in relation to anything we have attempted before, it will leave us far short of solving the entire financing problem. In Washington, therefore, we shall ask the President and his committee and the Congress to approve the expenditure of large sums of federal money for Alaska's reconstruction. The amount, of course, to be determined by the final accurate assessment of replacement costs. We will also ask for a relaxation of many of the procedures that are required under federal programs in ordinary times, but which are simply not adequate to cope with a disaster of this great magnitude. Finally, we will ask for many rearrangements of past relationships established between Alaska and the federal government. Because of the earthquake, our relationship with the federal government today is one that no other state has had. These new conditions must be recognized. Some of our requests will be made in the area of administrative rules. Some must be resolved by congressional action. When we return from Washington, we should have definite requests to make for changes in state law to comply with the new situation. In addition to asking for prompt action on the bonding proposal, I believe two additional actions are immediately necessary. First is passage of the bond anticipation note bill now before you. This would provide us with a head start on many projects that must be initiated to take the greatest advantage of the coming construction season. Second is passing of the revenue anticipation note measure that is also before you, the legislators of the state of Alaska. With the flexibility this act would provide, we could retain a maximum amount of state deposits in Alaska's banks to keep their reserves strong in this trying time. Without this authority, there could be need for withdrawal of substantial sums from Alaska's banks just when these monies are most needed to rebuild our state. Also, I want to say that under the emergency powers granted me before last week's recess, I have assured all those holding bonds for Alaska municipalities, school districts, and other subdivisions that the state will guarantee bond payments. The state will not permit the default of any bond now held. To permit such a default at this time could seriously cripple our standing in the investment and financial communities, which we could not afford in any measure whatsoever. There is a tremendous amount of work to be done. Passage of the measures I have recommended will only be the beginning. The state budget for the year beginning July 1 also remains to be considered when we have enough information to make realistic estimates on revenue. It is fortunate that the legislature was in session at this time of crisis and prepared to move swiftly into action. I will need more than ever before your advice and support in the weeks and months ahead. In closing, I want to say, since we last met, a united and determined people has been welded together from the heat and shock of disaster. Today we share a common pride. We share a common goal, healing the scars and wounds and going forward to build a better Alaska than the one we have known. We are a young state. We are a young people, but we are mature. Along with so many thousands of others, I shed tears unashamed at what my eyes saw in a land I love. But from our sorrow has come strength, and from our strength and unity, a greater tomorrow.
Governor Egan speaking to a joint session of the Legislature, and all people have no issue. He is now leaving, and we will, to our knowledge, the chair now says that they entertain a motion to return, and the Senate will now reconvene in its own studios, and the House will stay put if Mr. Kendall's orders. And I believe we're going to have a short recess coming up here in a few moments, at which time we will possibly be able to talk to a few of the representatives here. I don't know whether the senators will be available or not, and get a few comments on the speech here this afternoon. Maybe we can possibly get a few words from Representative Rivers here a little later on, and we'll see what the possibility is on that, and what the action is in the House of Representatives. And they have had a unanimous consent for a recess, and Mr. Boardman made the... And he has now called. We will see if we can get out of here. Jeannie, would you like to say a few things while I move down over the edge here, and then you can wander around and join me?
I'll be happy to, Buck. I was touched today by the governor's message when he spoke of, we are a young state, we are a young people, but we are mature. This has been my observation of the people throughout the Anchorage area during the entire disaster that has struck. And as refugees and evacuees have been brought into the Anchorage area, and we've talked to them, we've been impressed by the maturity with which they have faced this disaster. Among the strongest, I presume, I think it would be rather difficult to say who was the strongest of character and who stood up the best. For as Governor Egan said, this has been a proud people, a strong people, who has faced disaster and now faces the future. But when Governor Egan arrived in Anchorage Saturday, he arrived on a serious mission. When he took then his first aerial view over the stricken areas on Sunday and came back, he was a man racked in grief, for truly he had viewed destruction of a country he loved, and yet not losing himself in his grief, he took to the task of welding together a stronger Alaska and making plans for the future. Now we would like to talk to some of the other men who are going to play a very important role in guiding this state through its reconstruction period. Buck Emery, you have a gentleman you wish to talk to?
Yes, we have Senator Harold Hansen from Cordova. Good afternoon, Harold.
How are you, Buck?
Fine. What did you think of the governor's address this afternoon?
Well, I thought it was real stirring, real inspiring. He seems to have as much information as he possibly get at his fingertip, and we'll say this, he has control of the situation.
About what do you think might have to be done over in your area of Cordova?
Well, the thing hasn't quite gelled yet. We seem to have a little problem with the land level has raised. We seem to be a little short of water in our harbor there. Our good ship Chilkat, our ferry, seems to be dry at half tide. Of course, it indicates a large dredging project if this condition continues.
How about the two canneries there on the dock? Do you think that you we'll be able to get them in operation?
Well, I believe the one crab cannery that we were mostly concerned with will be back in operation this coming week. Of course, we've lost about $100,000 worth of crab pots, but we're trying to find ways to finance replacements. I'm sure that it'll be done. I have an optimistic outlook on that segment of the fishing industry.
Mm-hmm. How about salmon?
Well, salmon, my thoughts aren't completely put together on that. I can't arrive at any conclusions yet due to some unknowns up the Copper Rivers, and we have not got our spawning bed samples yet taken in the Prince William Sound. We'll have more on this within probably 10 days.
Mm-hmm. So things don't look too bad up around Cordova Way.
Well, I'll say this, things look pretty bad for our Copper River Highway.
Yeah, it don't look good in that department.
$31 million worth bad.
Oh, that is bad. Well, Harold, we thank you. Anything else you might like to comment on this?
No, I think that we will come up from this disaster, and I think we'll have a bigger, better Alaska economy, and we can only go one way. Is go ahead, Buck, and I thank you for letting me speak on your program.
Okay, and we thank you. Now, let's see. All right, here, Jeannie's
Yes,
got
we
another
have
one.
Benny Leonard from Anchorage, Alaska. I was just telling Benny, the last time I saw you, you were in turnouts and a hard hat, heaving to with a shovel in downtown Anchorage. It's good to see you with a shave and a clean suit of clothes on here in Juneau, Benny.
Well, certainly different than when you last saw me, Jeannie. I'd been about 4 days, I guess, day and night with the fire department there, and then later we even went up to the ACS to work on a teletype up there. Jim Parsons and I. Jim was on the casualty list down there. That is, he was working on the list in Anchorage, and then yesterday I went out and I was driving buses all day, so we really had a full week's work.
Yes, it was really a situation of everybody turn to and do whatever you can do. Now then, about the governor's proposal here, Benny, do you see any opposition, or do you feel that this spirit of standing together is going to hold through this move too?
Well, Jeannie, I think this is a lot like some of the things that you yourself witnessed in Anchorage. To hear the story of what happened up there is one thing, but to see it is something entirely different. And I don't think anybody who did not get to see it can understand actually what did happen. And I think that most of the legislators, not all of them, of course, but most of them from our area were able to see this. In fact, I personally took a number of them out into those areas to see it, and they were certainly appalled at what they saw, and they said it was quite different than anything that they had read or anticipated even in their own minds.
The pictures don't even make it look nearly as horrible as it really is. And I understand this is true, too, of Cordova and Seward and Valdez.
Well, that is really true, Jeannie. Jim Parsons has a whole set of pictures that the engineers put out, and they're going to be on television tonight here in Juneau. And even to look at the pictures, you can't actually believe it until you see the little tiny people by the great big cracks in the earth, and you realize how tremendous they are.
And how fortunate we were that there were so few lives lost.
Well, I think that is really tremendous, Jeannie. In fact...
And you really expect, then, the legislature to stand together in the same spirit and take swift, firm action on this?
Well, we just got here about an hour ago, and I haven't really spoken to anyone about it, but I have heard no opposition in any way to those that I have spoke to about other things. Of course, I didn't know exactly what the governor was going to propose. Perhaps others did, but I have been so busy that I didn't get to hear his message even on Wednesday. But I think that the legislature will do just like the people in Anchorage, that they will pull together and do whatever they can for the state. I think it's going to be real important that we get back on our tax base again, because we have really lost it both citywide in Anchorage, in Kodiak and Valdez, and we have lost a great deal in the state because it was tied to the federal tax structure.
Yes, I think that is the main concern of so many people, is the severe blow to our economic structure because of the large tax base that was struck.
Well, I used to be a city councilman in Anchorage, Genie, and I figure that they have lost close to 5 mills in their tax base there, not counting the revenue from their utilities, which they have been getting in the past. And with a loss like that in the city, and then statewide with this state tax being tied to the federal tax, which will be forgiven, well, I think that we really have a problem here that is going to have to be overcome with help from the national government.
And possibly the best way to get that is to go to them and say, look, this is what we've dug up in spite of the fact we have nothing to give. Will you help us finish it out?
Well, I think, Jeannie, it's real important that we stay in session down here long enough so that we can, as a group, do whatever we can to show the sincerity to the federal government so that we can get some help. Because I think if we break up at this point, individually, we can do very little. But I think together down here, where we can show some positive direction to this, and I hope that we do get together and do this. And the fellows I've talked to certainly indicate that that's what's going to happen.
So we can expect our legislature then to go on for an indefinite period of time?
Well, I don't know what you can expect, Jeannie. I
Well,
would
actually,
say at
I'm
least
sure
a
I'm
couple of
asking
weeks.
too quickly.
I would say a couple of weeks at least, maybe even more, depending upon the problems we run into.
You will at least find it necessary to be here until the governor returns from Washington anyway.
Well, a lot longer than that, Jeannie, because he's going to come back with more recommendations, which we're going to have to work on. And I think our old state budget that we had is just going to go right out the window. In any area that we can get the federal assistance in, we should just throw our budget out and put it into reconstruction instead and just lean on the federal government for aid in those particular fields.
Were you looking for...
Yeah, I got Bruce Kendall around one corner. Bill Boardman got him. And
Will
we
our
got
line
him.
pull around? Oh.
I don't think it'll be quite that far, but we'll run back in and get him. And I've got Ralph Rivers around another corner talking to Dorrit Sweeney. So why don't you brief them recently on what the governor has done, and I'll see if I can kind of blast them loose there.
All right. Thank you, Buck. And thank you, Benny, for taking time to talk with us. Before this, we went on the air here at the State Capitol building in Juneau today. Congressman Ralph Rivers was welcomed by Speaker of the House, Bruce Kendall. Congressman Rivers sat in on the joint session of the legislature, and here we now have Bruce Kendall speak.
And we're going to have to interrupt this broadcast for just a moment. Here's a bulletin from radio station KINY. Another sharp earthquake, not as long nor as severe as the one which devastated large sections of south-central Alaska last Friday, shook Anchorage today. The tremblor sent people streaming into the streets from buildings already damaged by the Good Friday earthquake. There was no apparent damage in the downtown area, and there was no immediate report of casualties. The quake struck at 12:41 p.m. Alaska Standard Time, which would have been 2:41 our time here. That was just about 4 minutes ago. The Anchorage Times building, the quake in the Anchorage Times building, the quake seemed to start with a general rocking motion and then pick up in intensity with a moment or two. We'll be keeping you posted as more reports come in on this, another of a series of aftershocks in Anchorage, Alaska. And we would like to request listeners in the KINY listening audience not to call the station. We are quite busy with communication between studio and transmitter. We'll pass along information just as soon as we have it. We understand this earthquake was not as severe as the one that rocked Anchorage last Friday, but we will keep you posted. Plea again, please do not call radio station KINY. We'll return now to the floor of the Senate.
Approach the budget, the normal, usual budget, for at least 30 days or sometime in the near future until a complete assessment of all the facts can be made. As you know, this thing hit Friday night. We're just 8 days now from the time that the disaster struck. It took 3 days to preserve life and limb and try to get some health conditions restored and to feed the people. Then we've only had actually about 3 days to assess damage. And the phenomenal thing about the whole thing is the small death toll compared to the tremendous disaster. Every death naturally is a disaster, but a disaster of this magnitude, it could have been much greater in numbers. And I think that's due to the fact of time of day. It was 5:30 p.m. Everybody was vertical, everybody was alert, and most everyone was in transit from home to shop or office to shop, or they were in transit. had it been a couple hours one way or the other, I'm sure that the death tolls would have been staggering.
I thoroughly agree with you on that point, and I think we're most fortunate that there was no fire. This could have been in Anchorage total disaster.
This is one time we can thank God that the lights went out first.
Definitely.
Because I understand that had the electricity not gone out, why the fire marshals have told me that there would have been a greater chance of fire and catastrophe even beyond what the earthquake damage was.
This morning, the Senate back in Congress in the United States authorized on their behalf $50 million, which in some ways is just a drop in the bucket. How do you feel about our chances for increasing this? Senator Jackson, if memory serves me correctly, stated that there's a possibility of $200 million. Do you think we might get more?
On federal assistance at the congressional or presidential level, I feel as Speaker of the House of the State Representatives, I feel that any statements in regards to this should come from the governor, because the governor at this time is the sole spokesman as far as Bruce Kendall, the Speaker of the House, is concerned. Because you readily understand, Buck, that the governor could make one statement, I could make another, both being very truthful, but maybe they don't cover the whole book. So therefore, any statements on the federal level or on the banking level or on the military level, I feel that the governor should be the sole spokesman of the entire state at this time.
All right. Well, anything else you might want to say in closing?
Well, I feel that I'm very lucky. I lost my home, but my family is intact, not a scratch. The children are real upset. Every time there's a tremor, why, they're out of bed and out in the yard before we can even catch them. And that's terrible because they're under terrible strain. But my business is intact, and I am doing business, and I'm one of the lucky ones. And believe me, Mr. Buck, I'm going to do everything I can to help those that weren't so fortunate.
Well, thank you, Bruce Kendall. Now, I had Jeannie around here just a moment ago, and she, I think, ducked back into the house. I don't know. Let me stick my nose around the corner this way. No, I don't see her that way. And she is here someplace, and I think she has got somebody else for us to speak to. No, she must have ducked down the hall here for a moment. The legislators are standing here looking at a group of pictures which Jim Parsons from Anchorage has just hung up on the wall. I haven't had a chance to take a look at them myself. There are some shots in there we've never seen, and Jim has authorized us here on KINY TV down here in Juneau to show them on television if we can find some we haven't seen. We just possibly will do this. There's some of, right here at this corner, I see the McKinley building and the L Street apartments. The damage sustained to those buildings, which was tremendous and hard to believe. We see Mrs. Wade here from the Secretary of State, and also Governor Egan's wife, Neva, is here. And I have right over here Ralph Rivers, I see. I've been looking for you, and you've been standing right behind me. Good to have you up here in the state of Alaska. What did you think of the governor's speech?
This was an eloquent speech, and graphically portrays the situation.
Now, you have been back in Capitol Hill these past few days during this disaster. What was the common consensus of opinion in that area?
Correction, I was on the West Coast at a committee hearing when the disaster occurred, and I proceeded forthwith to Alaska. I didn't get to Juneau on my way north. I flew to Fairbanks within a day after the earthquake occurred, and I arrived in Anchorage at noon on Easter Sunday. After my first glimpse was the devastated area of Turning an Arm, which certainly would sadden anyone to see. Later I saw the downtown Anchorage and the crevasse on 4th Avenue and the wreckage of the streets on L Street, twisted buildings and fallen structures. But I was heartened by the fact that the people up there had united to overcome the problems and to pick up the pieces, you might say, and get the services, the municipal youth facilities and things going again, to take care of the injured and the homeless, They were doing a magnificent job, right, as the governor said, from the civil defense and local governments and the military and everybody all the way on down. Seward was noteworthy because the complete industrial complex of the docks and the railroad terminal and everything and the cargo handling capability was completely wiped away. But there's a nice residential community there at Seward yet, but without any industrial way of making a living. Then Kodiak was stricken, but not as badly stricken as Seward.
Congressman Rivers, I was just handed a note here a moment ago, said this program was interrupted a few moments ago and that Anchorage had another quake, and we don't know the seriousness or the consequences of it. So I think we might just terminate things here, turn it back down to the studio and see by our little portable radio if we can find out what's going on.
And I concur and thank you. That's my report up to this point.
Okay, and thank you, Congressman Rivers. And let's turn it back now to KINY and see if we can get further information on this quake.
Thank you, Buck. This announcement came over the wires just about 10 minutes ago. Another sharp earthquake, not as long nor not as severe as the one which devastated large sections of south-central Alaska last Friday, shook Anchorage today. The trembler sent people streaming into the streets from buildings already damaged by the Good Friday earthquake. There was no apparent damage in the downtown area, and there was no immediate reports of casualties. The quake struck at 12:41 p.m. Alaska Standard Time. In the Anchorage Times building, the quake seemed to start with a gentle rocking motion and then picked up in intensity within a moment or two. Equipment, which was knocked to the floor last week, remained standing today. The earthquake lasted about 30 seconds. There's no word on what might have happened in the cities of Valdez, Seward, Cordova, and Kodiak, which were damaged extensively in the earthquake which struck at dusk a week ago. Monitoring our Associated Press wires, we have no immediate reports of damage or casualties. We understand that the quake was not severe enough to cause any new damage or any casualties. And so there seems to be a very relaxed air right now in the area that this quake is just, this new quake has just shook a little. Nobody seems upset or panicked in the least. There's quite a relaxed air on the wires, and so we're just going to assume this is just another in the many, many aftershocks that the state of Alaska has experienced since the quake. So we'll proceed now with a musical interlude until 3 o'clock, when we'll present a complete wrap-up on this latest development, plus national and international news.
Takeoff from Juneau at 11:22 p.m. Juneau time. After having a good night's sleep, we're arriving in Anchorage 3:30 Juneau time, 1:30 Anchorage time.